Hello, everybody. My name is Joseph Livni. Welcome to my book talk. I will introduce you to my book entitled The Resilience of Democracy. My background is engineering. Since when do engineers study democracy? Good question. However, I could ask, since when do scholars of political science or law study resilience? Resilience is the capacity to cope with disruption. Resilience or stability is an engineering problem, and engineers use proven tools to handle it. Consequently, resilience of democracy is a cross-disciplinary subject, and this book applies lessons learned from the study of equilibrium and stability to examine sustainability and resilience of democratic societies.
Naturally, you will ask, what equilibrium, what stability, what theory? Equilibrium and stability theory offers a necessary and sufficient criterion determining the stability of the equilibrium of complex dynamic systems in engineering, physics, economics, biology, and other fields. Yes?
Excuse me, sir. Engineering, physics, economics, and biology are one thing. The study of the resilience of democracy is another thing. It involves history, social evolution, collective psychology, political persuasions. I don't even see the applicability of terms like equilibrium, stability, complex dynamic systems. Am I at the right book talk?
Yes, you are.
Thank you for the remark. In order to convince you, let me discuss the meaning of the terms sustainability and resilience as defined in social sciences, and then show that they correspond to exact science terms equilibrium and stability. So let's see what sustainability is. The Oxford English Dictionary lists several definitions of the term sustain. One of them is to keep in being, to continue in a certain state, to keep or maintain at the proper level or standard, to preserve the status of. In equilibrium and stability theory, equilibrium is when all elements maintain their measurable attributes at constant levels. Would you agree now that we are on the same page?
Yes, but what about resilience?
Resilience. Yes, I will borrow Tainter's definition. Resilience is the ability of a system to adjust its configuration and function under disturbance. In equilibrium and stability theory, stability is the property of a system in equilibrium to return close to its previous status of equilibrium when it is slightly disturbed. Disturbance of democracy can be losing elections, new ideology, autocratic tendency, war, epidemic, increasing crime.
Would you agree that we are on the same page?
I guess so.
Then what is an unstable equilibrium?
Good question. If one disturbs this equilibrium, it will not return to its initial state. The Roman Empire disintegrated. It evolved to a point of no return. One democracy also vanished, the Weimar Republic. The book explains why. Shall we continue?
Yes, please continue.
Now, I am curious how this is applicable to society in general and democracy in particular.
Thank you. This is exactly where the book steps outside the box. I will discuss the relevance soon. However, for the time being, I would like to focus on why this ball in the bowl is stable. The disturbance pushes the ball uphill. Gravitation pulls it down. This fight is considered a negative feedback loop. It is not difficult to get used to this jargon. Negative feedback loops are the secret of stability in physics, technology, planetary motion, and society. Chapter 3 illustrates the analogy between equilibrium and stability of two worlds, technology and society. We have a general schematic of control loop. Any control loop consists of three functions: control law, examination, resolution. I was tempted to say three branches: legislative, judicial, and executive. The schematic shows a control law box, a rhomboid, examining whether a deviation occurred, and an executive box that takes action if deviation from the control law occurred. The schematic is applicable to two unrelated fields: keeping the hot water temperature constant, keeping the business running. The control law decreases the desired temperature in one case and the running capital of the business in the other. The judicial branch examines whether the temperature or capital deviate from the level decreed by the control law. It is important to remember that the legislator decrees the desired level. Neither the judicial nor the executive have authority to mess with the control law. The judicial expresses a verdict. The executive applies the law. The three branches close a negative feedback loop. It is negative if and only if each branch is limited to function within prescribed boundaries. A negative feedback loop assures stable equilibrium. In the previous example, the criterion of stability was reasonably palpable. What makes society unstable? Not surprisingly, scholars of archaeology asked and answered this question more than others. They discovered how ancient societies grew strong and evolved into powerful empires: Fertile Crescent, Egypt, Inca, Rome, and suddenly collapsed. I use the term collapse for social instability because the archaeologists use this term for disintegration of social order. Archaeologists concluded that the reason of collapse is growing complexity. In the previous example, we saw that in a small business like a corner grocery store, the business has a good chance to survive disturbances for several generations. A large corporation, a great empire with hierarchies and interrelated functions, are complex. It is tempting to blame collapse on growing complexity, isn't it? However, this monograph explains that the difficulty consists of defining what complexity is and what grows to cause collapse. The book discusses several hypotheses, and I invite you to read them. We saw in the previous examples of temperature control and business capital management that there is a controlled magnitude involved, temperature in one and capital in the other. The study of equilibrium and stability deals with applications in a multitude of fields. In the general case, the controlled magnitudes are called state variables. The schematic here shows a multitude of state variables: size of the army, taxation, abandoned land, boats, time at dock, road transport duration, to name a few. In 2019, I published an article proving that pre-industrial empires collapsed because of the proliferation of their state variables. In other words, the more interrelated functions the imperial government was busy with, the faster the empire approached the brink of collapse. As a consequence, I prefer to define social complexity as the number of state variables of the system of government. The mathematical substantiation of the theory affirming that growing numbers of state variables destabilizes is found in the article.
The thesis of this book is that growing complexity is destabilizing in democratic societies as well.
Nevertheless, in democratic societies, there are stabilizing factors opposing the destabilizing effect of growing complexity. The most important factor is economic growth. In the pre-industrial societies, the economic output was mainly agriculture or agriculture-related products. The GDP grew due to land expansion. Land expansion required military might. Military might used up the marginal growth of GDP. The GDP growth was bound to stall at a point. The proof of the theory that growing complexity predicts collapse in pre-industrial societies took into account the prediction that sooner or later the GDP growth comes to a halt. In industrialized societies in general, and in democracies in particular, progress of science and technology predicts long periods of economic growth. Therefore, economic growth may outpace the growth in social complexity. However, the growing complexity still remains a destabilizing factor. As far as slowing down the growth of complexity is concerned, the adoption of the Mayflower Compact in Plymouth, Massachusetts represents a historic milestone. The importance of the event is not so much the compact itself, but the general consensus that such a document is necessary for establishing a government. The news was that the people proclaimed guidelines to government and not the other way around. Furthermore, a new style of governing took off. People limited the freedom of government, while in the old world, the princes limited the freedom of people. Puritans adopted functioning principles of church administration for managing their public life. Puritan New England was not yet a democracy. However, it started with an unprecedented feature that made American democracy possible: constitutionalism. Democracies replaced autocratic decision-making with a process of popular involvement like elections, free press, academic research, industrialization, market economy. The rigidity of social ladder has ceded to a meritocratic scale. Rationalism and science have replaced coercion and ignorance. Governments have consented somewhat to the will of the people. Notions like individual rights, liberty, presumption of innocence imply a more governable state. Are democracies resilient? The book examines a few aspects of the particular case of stability of an equilibrium involving democratic structure. Crime is a state variable that alone can bring down a democracy. A chapter is dedicated to stabilizing factors of crime control and to destabilizing misconceptions found mostly in democracies. The Weimar Republic is the well-known democracy that failed. Another chapter examines it with tools of equilibrium and stability theory. The book examines separately the United States, where constitutionalism nurtures the democratic system. Another chapter examines the stabilizing and destabilizing factors in other democracies. The monograph focuses on justice administration. Civilization rose in order to protect land and stored products. Crime alone can stop all functions of the state. Example, Haiti. A detective asks the alleged criminal, "Why do you rob banks?" Criminal answers, "Because that is where the money is." The monograph contends majority of criminals are rational.
We have a question here.
I've read quite a few references affirming that criminals are not rational.
I disagree. If most criminals were irrational, crime would be out of control. Societies would be inoperative. The chapter about crime concludes the following. Increasing the cost of crime reduces the percentage of criminals. The percentage of criminals in a society is determined by crime deterrence and less reoffending. Crime deterrence is related to the cost and benefit of crime. Diminishing reoffending implies reducing recidivism. Proportional punishment increases the cost of crime. Increasing the cost of crime reduces the percentage of criminals. Conversely, policies of not punishing crime increase the percentage of criminals. Theories claiming that less punishment decreases crime are destabilizing. Recidivism is an important factor determining the percentage of criminals. Our knowledge about causes of recidivism is immature. Education seems to be a generally accepted means of recidivism prevention. It is true that educated people are less inclined to repeat their offenses. However, educated people commit crimes which are tricky to repeat. If one teaches theories opposing incarceration or stigma, then education is more harmful than beneficial. The weakness of Weimar Republic did not consist of a bad constitution, but of lack of constitutionalism. There is a question here.
Constitutionalism and constitution are interrelated. Where there is constitutionalism, there is constitution, isn't there? Is this constitutionalism brain teaser necessary?
Thank you. Great comment. Constitution is a collection of basic principles and fundamental laws, institutions and practices put in place in public life and derived from human reason or social experience to maintain peace and well-being within a commonwealth. Constitutionalism is the name given to the trust which men repose in the power of words engrossed on parchment to keep a government in order. The American constitutionalism originated from public practices of Pilgrim and Puritan meeting house. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick states, just as a spiritual covenant had marked the beginning of their congregation in Leiden, a civil covenant would provide the basis for a secular government in America. End quote. It entailed office holders like elder, captain, and governor. The Mayflower Contract, for example, specifies that all these institutions were due for submission and obedience to mutual consent. Weimar emerged from the ashes of the German Empire. For better or for worse, the population conserved previously negotiated rules determining their place in the public order. Europeans followed the American example, and with various degrees they imposed on kings, princes, and other rulers a constitution. As opposed to America, in Europe, constitutions were not and could not be copied from recipes engraved on operational public life. In Europe, aspirations for liberty, equality, and prosperity were products of thinkers who are known as Enlightenment. In Germany and in the Austro-Hungarian empires, the quote, by the people, unquote, phrase could not penetrate the social contract. The emperors understood that they are for the people. Any initiative by the people remained off limits. Weimar Republic had no choice but democracy. However, societies don't hop models. The Weimar Republic became a mix-up of imperial contract with democratic peppering. Dobrin called it, quote, a republic with no instruction manual, unquote. I translate that into something for the people, something by the people. The people had no familiarity with constitutionalism. The republic had a constitution, but no constitutionalism. The absence of constitutionalism caused questioning legitimacy of government, inapplicability of imported constitutional concepts. The so-called democracy was born with no preceding social practice, liberty, equality, constitutional rights, judicial review of law, constitutionality. One chapter of the monograph discusses key issues of equilibrium and stability in some examples of democracies in Latin America, the European Union, and democracies sharing the British parliamentary system. A separate chapter is dedicated to the United States. The United States is the model for all modern democracies. Constitutionalism evolved on U.S. soil from its ancestor, the Pilgrims and Puritan's covenantal public administration. As explained earlier, in the industrialized world, growing complexity does not lead to certain societal collapse. Nevertheless, growing complexity is still a destabilizing factor. Resilience is assured when stabilizing factors outweigh growing complexity and other destabilizing customs.
The chapters examine presence or absence of stabilizing factors in each of the listed socio-political organizations. The main stabilizing component is constitutionalism. Decentralization slows down growing complexity because it reduces the number of state variables at both levels, federal and state.
Judicial review constitutes a negative feedback loop in the interrelations of the three government branches. The text of the Constitution hints at the degree of constitutionalism the Constitution possesses. Constitutions conceived without constitutionalism authorize the government in general, and the executive branch in particular. Constitutionalism envisages limiting the government, not empowering it. In Latin America, the absence of constitutionalism is prominent. In Brazil and Argentina, the results of elections matter. In November 2025, Venezuela sticks out as non-democratic whatsoever. At the supranational level of the EU, specialized departments manage the Union. The administrators are specialized technocrats. They are not elected. Politicians of individual states nominate council operators. For example, in Italy, political parties receive an allocation of nominated technocrats. Results of elections in Italy determine the proportion of the technocrats each political party nominates. Elections therefore matter. However, once technocrats move to Brussels, they act considering technical solutions. On the other hand, their loyalty to the party does play a role in the modus operandi of the Council. The Council decrees thousands of regulations. Once the elected EU Parliament ratifies the regulations, they are binding all over the EU territory. The Prime Minister is an elected member of Parliament. The head of state nominates the Prime Minister, tasking him to form a cabinet. The reason to choose him is because he leads the majority or the largest minority, or he is able to form a coalition guaranteeing a majority vote in Parliament. The PM nominates members of cabinet and the Parliament confirms the cabinet. Parliament is elected by the people. It decrees laws, it approves budget, it approves or rejects the executive. The judicial may consist of several levels of courts. The justices are nominated based on their expertise. One cannot rule out that nomination involves political loyalty. Higher courts carry out judicial review. They examine constitutionality of laws, rejecting unconstitutional laws. The highest court of the land is mostly called the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rejects unconstitutional acts of other branches. The British parliamentary system also evolved from practice justice and involves trust in an agreed constitution written either on paper or on national memory by tradition and practice. This schematic illustrates the interaction of the US government with public functions in the US. Two elected branches of the government guarantee democracy. One nominated branch defends constitutionalism. The three branches of the federal and state governments join together into a socio-political collection known as the American constitutional democracy. Public life involves public and private institutions interwoven with government on one hand and among each other on the other. Education, research, grants, public opinion, media, elections, public participation, culture, books, pamphlets, prayer house, sport events, and other public gatherings constitute the building blocks of the vibrant American democracy. The chapter dedicated to the US portrays how this multitude of bodies reaches steady state. Most importantly, the chapter focuses on stabilizing and destabilizing tendencies of this intricate American socio-cultural canvas. In the Old World, kings held divine authority to rule, to allow or disallow freedoms and rights, to judge, to declare war or sign peace. Opposed to that, in American colonies, governments acted within limits inscribed on written acts. The concept that such limits are a supreme necessity has been etched in the American collective mindset from the landing of the Mayflower. The US Constitution is a product of constitutionalism. In other words, the framers preserved liberties of individuals, confirmed sovereignty of states, outlined institutions, and set limitations on the government, preserving existing rights and liberties of we the people. The Bill of Rights lists the unalienable rights of Americans. Are these the only protected rights? The Ninth Amendment answers in the spirit of constitutionalism. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. One would judge that the task of supreme justices is well defined, wouldn't one? Not so fast. The Supreme Court justices subscribe to two opposed schools, originalism and living constitution. For example, the Ninth Amendment is placed on the fault line of divide between the two competing philosophies. Originalism. According to originalists, the Constitution's meaning is fixed at the time of adoption. Judges interpret text based on original public meaning. Unstated rights, like those referenced in the Ninth Amendment, are not a basis for creating new rights. We, the people, understood that rights that did not exist then will emerge and require protection. Therefore, on top of legislation, the framers devised a procedure of amendments. For originalists, the Ninth Amendment is a rule of construction. It rules out the postulation that listed rights are the only rights. Living Constitution. This school maintains that constitutional meaning evolves with society. Broad clauses like liberty adapt to modern conditions. According to the Living Constitution School, the Ninth Amendment affirms that rights not enumerated exist and can be judicially recognized. The Living Constitution concept is in favor of recognition of rights not foreseen in 1791. This schematic is a control loop. It has 3 branches. Each branch has limited authority. In terms of equilibrium and stability theory, Living Constitution reminds of a water tank control loop that allows messing with the thermostat settings. Unauthorized interference into the control law causes loss of confidence in the proper temperature at equilibrium. The achieved temperature varies randomly. Once there is no equilibrium, one cannot even talk about stability. This chart shows the 3 branches of government. 2 of them elected by the people. A feedback loop is observed. Government approves research grants to academic research. Let me remind you that academia has an additional function: education. Research results and education shape the public opinion which affects election results. Election results affect grant allocation. The loop is closed. Can these loops become destabilizing positive feedback loops? The book discusses this question, and in this book talk, I will summarize for you some of the difficulties. In chapter 6, about Weimar Republic, the book analyzes how education worked against common sense. In the Weimar Republic, professors positively fed back anti-democratic doctrines. A remarkable collection of works, The Betrayal of Humanities, explains how higher education not only did not stop evil, but it also fed it. I will quote from chapter 6. Universities are essential to progress. Educating for democratic values would help if it were promising. The evidence is not encouraging. We are not in Nazi Germany. The bad news is that as far as democratic values are concerned, some facts indicate that the current Western higher education replicates failures of Weimar. End of quote. The good news is that America emerged on soil impregnated with constitutionalism. The trust of people in the power of words engrossed on parchment to keep a government in order is the good news. Grants, education, research may and somewhat do go awry. Nevertheless, the wisdom of we the people and its strong desire to keep the government, any government, in order has been manifested in elections. In America, as in other democracies, parties lose elections. In America, losing elections matter more than anywhere else. It matters because of constitutionalism. Chapter 8 concludes the following. The United States is practically in equilibrium. The question is whether this equilibrium is stable. The main stabilizing factor is American constitutionalism. It practically surfaced in 1620, and it has matured during its 4 centuries of existence. Checks and balances have worked. Centralization slightly increased along the centuries. However, municipal law enforcement fights criminals. States legislate and enforce their laws. Democratic elections at all levels of the Federation determine who legislators and governors are. In the United States, judicial review is effective in spite of political friction and even attempts of the delegitimization. On one hand, the academic institutions have significantly contributed to the unprecedented progress in science and technology. On the other hand, the academic institutions drive destabilizing persuasions, breaking meritocracy. The last chapter discusses an example of a grand-scale project in order to illustrate the shortcoming of central governments directing science and technology projects. The example is about electric vehicles. The electric vehicle is simpler than internal combustion vehicle. It has less mechanical intricacies, less moving parts, easier to control, and it promises to reduce maintenance costs. The electric vehicle already possesses most of the advantages of the gasoline engine means of transportation and promises to acquire some advantages over it. However, its main disadvantage consists of cumbersome energy storage and charging. This chapter is not about that competition. The chapter illustrates risks involved in governmental interference in the pace of adopting the concept. Research institutions funded by government publish ecological admonitions. Government initiates corrective actions. If governmental corrective actions include further grants substantiating ecological perils, then government closes a dangerous destabilizing feedback loop. The practical application of equilibrium and stability theory to studying questions regarding resilience of democracy consists of distinguishing between stabilizing and destabilizing government structures and actions. The following courses of action are found to be stabilizing. Constitutionalism, strong adherence to a set of rules preventing government from denying liberty, equality before the law, freedom of speech, freedom of business, freedom of religion, and so on. Federalism, do not govern, but constituting states can govern. Capitalism, meritocracy, and free competition. The book makes compelling arguments regarding the stabilizing power of capitalism and of its features in a democracy.
1. Constitutionalism is the spirit that makes constitution a proper control law in a democracy. 2. Negative feedback loops are the secret of stability in biology, technology, and democracy. Thank you for the attention.